Ladies and gentlemen, today is September the 1st, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo,
Hey, how are you?
pretty good. Just took the cat out for a walk.
Doing okay?
Yeah. Cat had a good walk in the hallway. We have a little harness and leash that we take him out on. I didn't know that cats like going on walks.
I've heard of it, but I still don't entirely believe it.
It's different from walking a dog. With a dog, you can oftentimes command them to walk with you, and they do so. With a cat, you have to entice them to walk in a certain direction. And we have the leash as a safety in case he tries to run or something. But he's pretty good. He likes to follow us because people are stability and safety and a guarantee of future food. So we don't have too much trouble corralling him back home whenever he walks around.
I can relate.
The comforts of home. Humans and cats appreciate them.
How'd you have a good week?
Yeah. I been doing a schedule with the stream where I'm starting at a certain time every day. That's been interesting. I haven't really held myself to that for most days of the week. When I was leading the WoW guild, we would have to start at a certain time. But aside from that, maybe I'm live at noon, maybe I'm live at 4 p.m. Who knows? It wasn't really fixed. So I'm trying to be a little bit more on point about that. And it's been good thus far. A lot of people in Europe can't really watch the stream as much if I start really late.
Ah, gotcha.
Yup.
Makes sense.
I posted the Raphael fight from our
I saw that.
4-man run. Yeah. Ours was very close. There are definitely ways that you can game it. I see people on Reddit bragging about beating him really easily, but his mechanics are very hard, so if you don't do it quite right, you're going to take a lot of damage.
Yeah, it's very difficult even on the lower difficulty setting that I beat him on.
The music
Yeah.
and sound design of that fight is awesome. They're like singing to you as they're trying to kill you.
Yeah, you like that?
Mm-hmm. In my solo run, I picked up Menthara, and I did the portal defense fight for Thaniel, which I don't think we've done yet.
Ah, yeah, we were coming up on that.
That's a pretty hard fight. I didn't expect it. I was like, oh yeah, it'll just be like a couple units. Nope, it's many waves of units. Oh boy.
Well, so long as you have a magic missile, that helps a lot.
Oh yeah, because a bunch of them are like 1 or 2 HP.
Yeah. So it's pretty handy for that.
Nice.
Although I guess I haven't done it on honor mode, so maybe it's even harder.
I think that still would have been good. In hindsight, I should have done that. Yep, that's plugging along. I'm down to make some more progress in our run after we've talked about the world. Did anything happen this week?
Did anything happen? Not really. Nothing big, really. There's been some movement on some stories, I guess, but nothing dramatic.
Is there a reason that a viewer would want to know about the Belt and Road Initiative this week? Or do you think they're just being funny?
Nothing comes to mind. Maybe they're
Okay.
just curious. It's an important topic, given how influential it's been in the developing world over the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly a core component as far as Chinese influence around the world, but it's not as important as it used to be. Actually, the Chinese have been reducing their investment in the program over the past 5-some years. And they weren't really getting very good returns. Lots of countries defaulting and projects not really bearing fruit rather. Stuff like that. And then, of course, COVID happened, and so their budget kind of got squeezed. So a lot of different factors sort of came together as a result of the program being drawn down somewhat. They haven't gotten rid of it. It's definitely still there, but it's not like this big force like it used to be.
Yeah, it's a bit of a gamble, and then it would be a long-term payoff if they actually make money on it.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a long-term gamble, but I mean, in a sense, it was never really intended to make money. It was always more about one, influence diplomatically, and then two, industrial policy. Because a lot of the stuff that the Chinese would invest in was stuff that was peripherally related to a given country's trade with China. So, for example, investing in a country's infrastructure definitely helps that country's economy, but it also facilitates imports and exports. And of course, if you're China, an export oriented economy, that's pretty useful for you. And then there's stuff that's related to industrial policy goals within China, like, say, trains. Nobody really talks about high speed trains anymore as far as Chinese industrial policy, but maybe 10 years ago or so, that was a priority. And so what you saw sort of back then is that there were a number of projects involving trains, some high speed, some not, that invariably ended up importing most of the train carriages and rail and stuff from China, which of course helped develop the Chinese railway industry. So that was more the impetus than making money. So I don't think they really expected to turn a big profit, but I don't think they expected to lose as much money as they ended up losing either. I mean, if you look at the IMF's history in the developing world, you'll note that a lot of the loans end up either non-performing or just outright having to be scrapped as part of some kind of debt forgiveness program. Because a lot of countries have governments that don't really care too much about paying back the money they borrow. They tend to have a very short-term horizon as far as planning. Guys in power in countries that have very weak, corrupt political institutions tend to focus more about how much value they can extract from their position over the course of the next maybe like 10 years or so. And then anything after that is somebody else's problem. So, if they can make a bunch of money embezzling money from loans that they take from overseas, be it from, private sector lenders or the Belt and Road program or the IMF or whoever, they're not averse to doing that, even if it means there's going to be a debt crisis later on, because that debt crisis is not going to impact them personally that much. They'll have their money and they can just leave the country if they need. That's more of a problem for everybody else.
Yeah.
And they're not too concerned about that. So that's been a big reason why there's been recurring debt crises in many developing countries with weak political institutions. They just don't have the administrative capacity to really police that and prevent it from becoming a recurring problem. So the Belt and Road kind of suffered from that. They basically just learned the hard way what a lot of private sector lenders in the West already knew, which is that you have to be careful when you lend to countries with weak rule of law. You never really know if you'll ever get your money back.
Yeah, they don't really have strong enforcement mechanisms to make sure it's spent correctly.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Well, while we're in the eastern side of things, my brother is actually visiting Japan right now. So I don't know
cool.
if there's any question that you might have for him, but he gets to be there in person doing stuff.
What part of Japan is he in?
I have no idea. I don't know if he's listening right now, but he had to get a random, tiny hotel one night because I think him and his friend were arriving at different times, so they're separated right now before they can team up. And they definitely can deal with smaller space than what someone from Texas, for example, might be used to.
Yeah.
When it comes to rooms and closets and all that kind of stuff.
Well, is he there for business or pleasure?
Pleasure.
Oh, okay, tourist. So I would guess Tokyo. That's generally where the tourists go, but it could be some other place.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the two questions I can think of off the top of my head, these are like big picture questions, I guess, so I'm not sure how they could necessarily be answered if you're just there like as a tourist. But I guess one, how many entrepreneurs have you met? Because one of the structural shifts in Japan's economy has been a shift away from sort of the salaryman career. A lot of those jobs are going away because Japanese companies have been facing the same pressure that Western companies have faced, which is that they need to outsource a lot of jobs overseas and they need to cut costs in order to maintain their competitiveness and profitability. So the result is that there's actually less job security now in Japan that there used to be. Still a lot more than in the West, but by Japanese standards, it's getting more and more dicey. And the result is that more and more people have been getting involved more in entrepreneurship just out of necessity, because they don't really have the same avenues, the same career track avenues that their predecessors had. So I would be curious if it's been noticeable at all. Have there been more people like working small shops on the street vendors, or maybe even people doing bigger operations? But again, I don't know how visible that would necessarily be.
Was that for foreigners working as entrepreneurs or
Japanese
natives?
Themselves?
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. It's been a big change for them. The political and economic culture is not one that necessarily rewards risk taking.
Mm-hmm.
So traditionally, they've been more risk averse in that regard. Even at the highest levels of the Japanese economy, like you really don't see Japanese venture capital firms or Japanese investment banks doing all that much, especially outside of Japan. Like they've been notoriously risk averse in that regard. SoftBank, I think, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, went out of its way to try to start investing overseas, but it did not go well. And a big part of that is just because they were not very experienced at it. Like they really had not done it before. A lot of Japanese investment overseas historically has just been investing in production in places like the United States to get around, trade tension, and then investing in things like property. So they're not really that experienced at actually investing in businesses overseas. They prefer to focus on their own market for that. You also kind of saw a similar phenomena with like Japanese phone technology. Back when I was a kid, many, many years ago, in the aughts, Japan was known for having like better, more advanced phones than anybody else. But you didn't really see them outside Japan much because the phone companies in Japan that manufactured those never really focused on export. Right? They were actually almost entirely focused on serving the Japanese market, and they didn't really bother with exports hardly at all. And so you really didn't see those advanced Japanese phones outside of Japan much. And then, of course, eventually there was a technological leapfrog where American firms innovated the smartphone, and by that point it was too late. So then the Japanese were just kind of caught off balance, and they haven't really been able to catch up in that regard yet.
So were they ahead in like the BlackBerry-ish phase or just before then?
Yeah, I would say kind of the BlackBerry-ish phase, more around the time of like flip phones and stuff, that era. Yeah, they were quite advanced. Very advanced graphics, user interfaces. The capability of the phones was much higher than flip phones in the West. There was actually a fairly active mobile gaming market at that time in Japan, well before there was any significant equivalent in the West.
Yeah, now mobile gaming market is massive. It's way bigger than non-mobile gaming just because everyone has access to them.
Yeah, exactly. So the Japanese were actually early pioneers in that regard. They even got a Final Fantasy game on their phones, which has never been released in the West.
Huh.
Yeah, what was it? Final Fantasy VII Crisis? No, not Crisis Core. Something. I don't remember the title, but it was a spin-off of 7. And it was like a prequel to 7. I don't think there was anything like too significant that happened story-wise, but it was notable just because it did expand the story a bit, and people outside Japan basically just did not get that at all. You can't even really get it now. I don't think anybody really even has the original kernel that you would need for like the phone operating system it was designed for. I don't think that exists anymore. So I don't think it's even possible to play that.
Interesting. Yeah, I never really got into the Final Fantasy games, but I know who Tifa Lockhart is, so.
So does the Italian Senate.
So
And
funny.
he was very popular on the internet. Yeah, so Japan, they've kind of been struggling a bit with the bigger changes that have been happening in the developed world, as economically speaking, for a while now. So I guess my question would be, is that noticeable? Has there been much noticeable evidence of that?
Would it be kind of like gig economy type stuff?
Yeah, there's that. That's definitely prominent. That's become prominent pretty much everywhere, though.
Mm.
But I was thinking more in terms of people like actively starting their own businesses. Because Japan definitely does have some entrepreneurial tradition, but from what I'd read, it's becoming somewhat more pronounced. Again, just out of necessity.
So that was question one. You said you had two off the top of your head?
Um, yeah, that's. I was trying to remember the second one. Oh yeah, has there been a noticeable backlash against tourists? Because that's another thing I was reading about. Yeah, about 10 years ago, Shinzo Abe, who was then still prime minister of Japan, implemented this strategy where he wanted to significantly increase tourism to Japan to help boost the economy. Because, of course, Japan's economy over the past couple decades has been notoriously sluggish. And, of all the things he did to boost the economy in Japan, that was probably the most successful, maybe the only successful effort. And so there has been a significant increase in tourism to Japan, as well as just an increase in immigration generally. Although I don't think like work visas or whatever the Japanese equivalent to that would be have increased by nearly as much as tourism has. And from what I was hearing and reading, there is some consternation from some quarters in Japan about the degree of tourism, especially with some of the bad behavior of the tourists that come over. So I would be curious if that's been noticeable at all.
Yeah, I was embarrassed by the Paul brothers whenever they visited Japan and they're like flopping about on vehicles and just being obnoxious in a way that in the US to see random people on the street doing that would not be that weird, but in Japan where there's a lot of value on not disturbing the collective peace, it was
Hmm.
very out of place and very disrespectful.
Yeah. Yeah, not a great look, but yeah, we Americans kind of have a reputation for that,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
We are loud.
Yeah. Well, I hope he enjoys Japan. That's a fun trip from what I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard it's a very nice place. Good food,
Very,
relatively clean.
and they treat you pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
so long as you're not Chinese.
Do they not like Chinese tourists, especially?
Yeah, Chinese tourists also have a reputation. And in Japan, it's probably actually even worse than Americans. Yeah, I have Chinese friends, and from
Mm-hmm.
what I've heard from them, traveling in Japan has not been an entirely positive experience. They still go, they still like it, but they don't really feel like they're treated as equals. They kind of
Mm-hmm.
feel like the locals look down on them a little bit.
I would like to visit someday. I think Japan and South Korea are pretty high up on the list because it seems like a lot of reasons to go and not too many downsides.
Yeah. Well, expensive.
Yeah,
That
getting
would be
over
the
there
big
is
one.
the difficult part.
Yeah, it's expensive, and the flight is a motherfucker. It's like a 12-hour flight.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long time to be in a little seat.
Mm-hmm.
I did it once. Well, I guess technically twice, since obviously it was a two-way flight. But yeah, you definitely feel that by the end. You're very much ready to get off of the plane by the time you get back. Well, what else did we have? Yeah, some stuff happening in Israel, pretty much more of the same, though. There was a judicial reform proposal in Mexico. We'll kind of go over that if we have time. And a little Ukraine update.
Cool.
That's pretty much what we have on offer. I guess there was some other things. Somebody was asking last time about social media. I think his name is Pavel Durov.
Mm-hmm.
So I went ahead and drew up some notes on that. I didn't really talk about it before because I didn't really think it was all that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. It's not the first time that a government has cracked down on social media. Although, granted, pretty much none of those crackdowns have involved actually arresting and detaining the founder. So that's a little unusual, but I don't think anything's going to come of it either, really. So not too notable, but somebody did ask about it, so I could talk about that a little bit. And there was some news relevant to social media out of Brazil, so I figured I'd group those two stories together. In my notes, I just have it headlined "Social Media Bullshit."
People get in trouble for posting certain stuff, or what?
Well, I guess we could just get into it. In the case of Durov, he's the guy who founded Telegram. I think we've talked about that before. Mm-hmm. So that's the not Russian social media app, which is heavily used by Russians and Eastern Europeans generally. And Pavel Durov was a co-founder, I think. And he had been hanging out in the UAE, like a lot of other billionaires are wont to do. And he ended up in France for some reason. I actually read a rumor, that he was invited to France by President Macron. And apparently when he actually arrived in France and was arrested, Macron denied having any knowledge of that. So I don't know if that's true, but I did find it humorous. So I'm relaying the rumor to you for that reason. But regardless, he was in France, he was arrested, and the French government is saying that he's guilty of failing to cooperate with law enforcement over drug trafficking, child sexual content, and fraud on his application. Again,
Yikes.
Telegram. Yeah. Apparently the moderation is not to the satisfaction of Paris, so they're coming after him for those reasons. So again, I don't think much is going to come of that. It is kind of a heavy-handed move on the part of the French government, but, the French government kind of has a reputation for being heavy-handed, so maybe not that surprising in the grand scheme of things. But I don't think, Durov... he might go to jail. I don't know how, the charges... how strong the charges are, how strong the case is, etc. But regardless, I don't think it's going to result in substantive changes for Telegram or for moderation or for social media companies. If I'm a social media company, my takeaway is not going to be, man, I really need to moderate my platform more. My takeaway is going to be, stay the fuck away from France because I don't want to be arrested. So yeah, maybe avoiding French jurisdictions is going to be the move coming out of this for social media companies rather than the intended effect of actually encouraging moderation. Doesn't mean that some kind of deal won't be cut where maybe Telegram does improve some moderation practices to some degree, but by and large, the tech community doesn't really like getting bossed around by states, and they've actually got a pretty strong track record of managing to deflect that kind of pressure. So my money for now is on Telegram. But there is certainly a play being made here by the French government to try to assert some authority over the relatively ungoverned space that is social media. And then the other social media thing was came out of Brazil. There was a judge overseeing a case involving Twitter, basically involving misinformation, specifically regarding the attack / mob thing that happened after the last presidential election. People compared it to January 6th here in the United States, but it was a little different in Brazil because there wasn't actually any mechanism by which they could actually change the outcome of the election. They just kind of rioted in some government buildings. But there was a lot of accusations that Twitter facilitated misinformation involved with that incident, and so that's been working its way through the courts. And then recently, a judge ruled that Twitter was banned in Brazil. And to be fair, that was not like just some heavy-handed diktat. That was the result of an interaction between the judge and Twitter's representatives in Brazil. Because, you know, in cases like this, there's generally like some quid pro quo, right? The judges or the prosecutors or whomever try to cut a deal with whoever they're going after to try to do something different, right? They try to kind of lean on them to coerce them into adjusting their practices. In this case, they wanted Twitter to do more about misinformation. But Musk and Twitter were just totally unapologetic, and they didn't want to give any ground. They just said, no, this is an infringement on our right to run our platform how we want. This is overreach by the Brazilian government, and we are not going to cooperate. And so finally the judge said, okay, well, you're banned then. you can't do business in Brazil anymore. And so there's been some angsting in the, specifically by Elon Musk about that. He's been very critical, obviously, of the ruling, saying that it's politically motivated, that it's bullshit, and that the government here is oppressing Twitter, basically. So I'm kind of curious to see where that goes, because, you know, Brazil is a decent-sized market. I imagine Twitter would want to operate there. Musk did say that he was going to basically just completely withdraw Twitter's presence from Brazil, because obviously they had some offices there and stuff. So it could be that he just tries to ignore the ban and basically just kind of lean on the user base in Brazil, circumventing whatever measures there are to ban it. I don't know how extensive the ban is. Like, I don't know if they just mean that Twitter can't do business on the ground physically in Brazil, or if they're actually blocking the URL, like as in you can't get to Twitter in Brazil right now. I would defer to any Brazilians we have in chat as far as that. But it was a pretty dramatic ruling, you know, so that is kind of part of that trend we've seen of governments trying more recently over the past couple of years to assert more authority over social media companies.
Chat's saying regarding the Telegram situation that Russians are more worried because much of their communications related to the war are done on Telegram. They call in artillery strikes using the app.
Oh. Well, I hadn't heard that before. I did know that there were a lot of bloggers covering the war who operate on Telegram, and their postings are actually a major source of information, even for Western reporting. You know, the main think tank I know about in the West that's been covering the war is the Institute for the Study of War, and they actually lean pretty heavily on Russian language sources like those on Telegram in order to try to stay updated on what's going on and publish their daily reports on the conflict. But I had not heard that the actual Russian military itself was using Telegram. I don't think it's a good idea, but I guess whatever works, right? You know, if you can't do it otherwise, then yeah, you just have to improvise as best you can.
Mm-hmm. And then we have someone from Brazil saying that they can't access X without a VPN or Starlink. So it seems like they're blocking the site to users.
Gotcha. So that's a hard ban.
Yeah.
You can't use Twitter and
it's pretty
Brazil,
fast
then.
too. When did this happen?
This past week, I want to say. I think like earlier in the week. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but
yeah, this plays exactly into the stance that Elon Musk wants to take, though, because he's very much a freedom of information proponent. I think that was a big part of why he bought Twitter in the first place, was to try to shift the paradigm and take a stance.
I don't know about that. I don't think his motives for buying Twitter have ever really been made clear. He himself has been pretty cagey about that. I'm not entirely unconvinced that he didn't just get high and shitpost online and get himself into a corner, back himself into a corner that he couldn't get out of.
Mm-hmm.
He said some stuff that could be interpreted as a legally binding commitment to buy Twitter, and then after that, he may have found it difficult to walk that back. But who's to say? But yeah, I think a lot of tech bros, if not the tech sector in general, especially those who work in the industry who are kind of more around my age, tend to be a lot more libertarian in their outlook.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the industry's kind of been changing. I think we have a lot of guys who work in tech who kind of watch this. So I would kind of ask them, like, has there been a notable change in the industry and the people who work in it as far as libertarian leanings? Or maybe I'm just wrong about there having been libertarian leanings in general. That had always been my impression. But yeah, maybe I would ask for clarification on that from those of you in the know.
He bought Twitter because Twitter is necessary for his hype machine. Yeah, it makes sense kind of trying to go for influence victory of some kind.
He certainly does shitpost a lot on it.
Yeah.
And nobody can stop him.
Yep. How to avoid getting banned on Twitter, just buy it.
There you go.
Make the rules yourself.
What was it, like $90 billion?
Something silly like that.
It was very high. He overpaid for sure. Pretty sure he's not making that money back. Let's see. Oh yeah, there was some tensions in the Horn of Africa, a pension scheme in China, and then local elections in Germany. It was all the notable stuff I had for this week. So what jumps out at you?
Sorry, it was pensions and what were the other ones?
Local German elections, Horn of Africa tensions, pension scheme in China.
Horn of Africa tensions, is that in Djibouti?
It's not in Djibouti, but it is in the same region in which Djibouti sits. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, you can sit Djibouti wherever you need to.
Awesome. Well, the tensions basically have to do with a love triangle between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And it kind of centers around a couple of long-standing issues, but principally this current iteration of the tensions has to do with Somaliland, which I think we've talked about before. That's a part of Somalia that declared independence in 1991 after the Somali government collapsed. And they've been seeking recognition ever since, but nobody's been willing to give it to them because, well, partly because nobody gave a shit in the 1990s, principally, but then after the war on terror started, there was a sense that countries in the region, as well as the United States and other interested parties, needed to work with the UN-recognized government in Somalia to try to restore authority there, because Somalia was turning into, well, it was already a vacuum, but it was a vacuum that was increasingly filled with jihadists. And of course, during the war on terror, that was a problem. So the United States government did not feel it could recognize Somaliland for fear of undermining the government that they were trying to help support in Somalia proper. So the result is that Somaliland's been in a kind of international legal limbo ever since. So Ethiopia, for its part, doesn't really care too much about the situation in Somalia. Well, that's an exaggeration. They cared enough to intervene directly, 15 some years ago. So obviously they at least care a bit. But more specifically, they care also about having access to a port. Because if you're familiar with Ethiopia's history, you know that Ethiopia used to have a coastline on the Red Sea. But the territory, specifically the province, I guess, that controlled that entire coastline broke away in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't remember the exact year, but they declared independence and became the country known today as Eritrea. And tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea have been relatively high ever since. There was a kind of rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea a couple years ago, resulting in the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and the leader of Eritrea receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, actually. But tensions have kind of been meh since that Nobel Prize incident. That things have not gone great. They haven't gotten a lot worse, but they haven't really improved a lot either. And so the result is that Ethiopia is not really confident it can really regain access to its lost ports. So the government there has been looking for alternatives. They've talked with Djibouti about some kind of agreement to have free access to their ports, but the government has been kind of cagey about that. Djibouti is comfortable with maybe one port, but more, they're not as interested in that. So negotiations on that front have been delayed for years as a result of the reticence of the Djibouti government. So recently, the Ethiopian government has actually renewed its ties with the Somaliland government. And a big point of discussion has been free access to Somaliland's ports, because the territory has access to the Red Sea. Now, that would definitely help out Ethiopia as far as access to ports. But the problem, of course, is the Somali government, the UN recognized one being backed by the United States and actually Ethiopia itself, does not want anybody dealing with Somaliland in any kind of way that might support or otherwise reinforce Somaliland's claim to independence. And having a foreign country directly negotiate with what you consider to be a renegade province is going to be a sore point. Mm-hmm. You can ask the Chinese about that. They're in a similar boat. So they protested. The Somali government, which is not much, but, does technically exist and control some territory in Somalia, protested this arrangement. And the Ethiopian government's response was basically just to ignore them. Ethiopian government felt it has the leverage in Somalia. Somali government depends a lot on Ethiopian troops and money, so Ethiopia probably figured they could just kind of write this one off and just keep doing what they were doing. So interestingly, the Somali government actually made a play. And what they did is that they actually negotiated with the Egyptian government to have I think about 5,000 Egyptian troops deployed into Somalia to participate in the African Union mission in Somalia, which is basically the military of the Somali government. So that actually did happen, or rather it is happening. And the Egyptians are deploying that force. And the Somali government, for its part, the Ethiopian government, for its part, is very upset at this, because they see this as a direct threat, especially if the Egyptian forces end up deployed along the Somali-Ethiopian border. And it's worth mentioning, too, that the Somali government has actually requested that Ethiopia remove its troops from its territory and cease participating in the African Union mission. So it seems here like the Somali government is actually going to try to cut ties with Ethiopia, or at least curtail Ethiopian influence, so that it can cultivate a new relationship with Egypt. Now, the reason that this is a big deal for Ethiopia is not just that, they don't want foreign troops along their border. It also has to do with the fact that the Ethiopian government is not on the best of terms with Egypt. So the problem has to do with what's called the Grand Renaissance Dam. Basically, the short version of the story is that the Ethiopian government wanted to build a huge hydroelectric dam to provide power for its economy, because, like a lot of developing countries, they have trouble providing enough electricity for demand, to meet demand in its economy. So building this huge hydroelectric dam along what's called the Blue Nile, which is the main tributary of the Nile River, was a good way to do that. And they actually followed through with it, built the dam, it's generating electricity. I think they're in the process of filling the reservoir right now, because, it's such a huge dam that they can't fill the reservoir quickly. It was going to take 5 to 10 years, basically. It's just that big. Now, the Egyptian government really hated that, because they're afraid that the Ethiopian government will use its control over the flow of water down the Blue Nile River to basically coerce Egypt, over whatever. They see it as just a point of leverage. And it is technically possible here that Ethiopia could, if it wanted to, significantly curtail the flow of water, and which would have a significantly detrimental effect on Egyptian agriculture and the amount of arable land that they have available, because of course they're heavily dependent on irrigation from the Nile River. So anything that affects the flow of water down that river is going to have a big knock-on effect on Egyptian agriculture, and by extension the Egyptian economy writ large. So the Egyptians protested at the construction of the dam. They wanted there to be some kind of agreement which would guarantee Egyptian access to, a certain amount of water and whatnot. And the Ethiopians were not that interested in it. And the Egyptians have threatened them over it over the past 10, 15 years, but the Ethiopians have basically blown them off and said, fuck you. We need the dam, we need the power. So we're going to follow through on this. There's not really anything you can do anyway because you're, too far away. Not that far away, but, Egypt doesn't really have the power to project force all that far away from its borders. So the Ethiopian government probably figured they didn't have too much to worry about. So then this agreement happens between Somalia and Egypt, and now all of a sudden there's the prospect of about a brigade's worth of Egyptian troops being deployed along the border. So now the Ethiopian government is kind of upset about it. So that's the state of play right now. I haven't read any new developments on that. That's something that's kind of played out over the past month or two. So we'll kind of see where that goes. It's certainly an interesting development as far as political relations in the Horn of Africa. Keep in mind, too, Ethiopia and Somalia, before the Somalia's government collapsed in the early 1990s, were actually on pretty bad terms, because there's a whole region of Ethiopia which is mostly populated by ethnic Somalis, which, of course, Somali nationalists believe should be part of Somalia. And the Ethiopian government, it will not surprise you, disagrees. So there was a war fought over that territory in the 1970s called the Ogaden War, which resulted in the defeat of the Somalis. But even so, they've never given up claim over the region. And the Ethiopians, for their part, were more busy with the civil war in the 1980s to focus too much on it. And then, of course, Somalia collapsed in the early 90s. And so it really hasn't been at issue since then. But if relations between Ethiopia and the new Somali government fall out, there is the potential that Ethiopia could make some kind of play here, either to secure the territory or maybe even territory in Somalia to act as a buffer zone between themselves and Somalia, or maybe even a play to change the composition of the Somali government. How's that for a euphemism? They may try to engineer some kind of change in leadership to result in a government that is somewhat more amenable to Ethiopian interests. But that's all speculation. That's just stuff to kind of keep an eye on. We'll see where it goes, but it is an interesting, evolving story.
Yeah, I hadn't heard anything about it, at least in recent news, but U.S. news is kind of notoriously bad at missing out on Africa updates.
Oh, yeah. They barely cover it. Let's see. There's also an Israel update, Mexico and Ukraine. So that's also on the ledger if you're so interested.
Yeah, Chai was saying there were protests in Israel. They want to tell Netanyahu to step down or something.
Yeah, there's been some big protests that broke out today, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Basically, there was. I'm trying to think of the right word. Well, basically, 6 hostages were recovered, but they were dead. They found 6 dead hostages, and from what I was reading online, they were killed not long before they were recovered. Apparently, Hamas knew that the Israelis were closing in on them, so rather than just give up the hostages for nothing, they killed them to try to maintain leverage in terms of the remaining hostages. So obviously people were upset about that, but there has been growing pressure on the government to deprioritize the destruction of Hamas and to put more emphasis on some kind of hostage deal, to get the kidnapped Israelis back. And, the Netanyahu government, of course, is not that interested in that. It's very much a right-leaning government with some radical parties in its coalition. So they're kind of taking the opportunity to really come down hard on Hamas here. But the pressure then on the government has correspondingly grown with, more and more recoveries of dead hostages or, even live ones. There was actually Bedouin guy who had been kidnapped, who they recovered, who came out after the fact and said that he wished that the government would prioritize the hostage deal because it's been 8 months now since they were kidnapped, so that's a very long time, and conditions are not great, as you can imagine. So after this happened, right after these bodies were recovered, one of the largest unions in Israel, I think it's called Hadramat. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but one of Israel's largest unions came out and declared a general strike. And they're not demanding any kind of change to like working conditions. Rather, they're actually just demanding that the government agree to some kind of hostage deal. So they're directly taking action here to try to influence the government's policy on the issue. From what I was reading, it was just the one union. It's a large one, but it's not representative of like the whole labor force. So there are other unions that are not participating in this at this time. But after the announcement, there were a lot of people that hit the streets and started protesting against the government demanding a hostage deal. So that's been the latest drama in Israel. I don't think it'll be enough to change the government's mind. Netanyahu is pretty famously resistant to pressure of pretty much any kind. But it does suggest that tensions are ramping up. And, if you were following Israel during the whole judicial reform thing, you know how hot that can get. So something to keep an eye on. But other than that, it's pretty much business as usual, more killing. I think there was a humanitarian window, quote unquote, that was agreed to allow a polio campaign to progress because there were cases of polio that were found recently. So they're going to try to contain that as best they can. Hopefully they succeed. Polio is nothing to fuck around with.
Yeah, it's average time.
Yeah. And then the other interesting note was that Israel actually launched an operation in Jenin, in the West Bank, not in Gaza. And, that's not necessarily all that unusual, but in this case, it was relatively large. And so that had, that had me asking, why now? Like, when you've got so much going on in Gaza, why launch such a large raid in the West Bank? It seemed a little counterintuitive and heavy-handed to me. But then it came out that they had actually killed the head of Hamas in that operation. He was apparently in Jenin. So that kind of answered my question. It makes a lot more sense now. So it was, I think, a 3 or 4 day operation, something to that effect. And apparently it was just meant to target the head of Hamas. So he's dead. I don't know who's replaced him. I'm sure they've already got somebody, lined up to kind of fill the job. That's generally how it works in organizations like that. But that is a small success there for Israel, relatively speaking. But that's all I had for Israel.
Do we know roughly how many hostages are still alive?
What was it, like 60? I think most of them are either dead or have been recovered by now. A lot of them have died in captivity, either of natural causes or because they were killed. Mm-hmm. Some of them were actually killed by the IDF. That was a particularly tragic example. Not many, mind you, but there was at least one case I remember where that happened. So yeah, I want to say it's like around 60. I would defer to chat on that, honestly. I imagine somebody in chat knows like the exact number.
Mm-hmm. I would somewhat dispute that it's natural causes when you die as a hostage because you're put in a pretty unnatural situation, but I get your point of like just malnourished and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Not doing well in those kinds of conditions, understandably so. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Do we have any questions?
Don't know. We have Fuzzy Cord in chat. Ladies and gents, if you have a question for Mr. Adrian Smith, feel free to tag me or Fuzzy Cord in the chat. Someone's asking, Palestine, are they the bad guys? Not Not if you follow Instagram or TikTok. Those ones are definitely where they have a lot of the loud Free Palestine stance stuff.
Yeah, whether or not the Palestinians are the bad guys is a very, very subjective question.
That's a personal question.
Yeah, it's practically a personal question. So, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. People can kind of figure that out for themselves. But yeah, that's definitely a highly charged question. There's a lot of debate about that. If somebody wants to ask about the history of the conflict, I can talk more about that. But otherwise, as far as subjective judgments, I don't really have much to say.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody cares what like some random guy on Twitch has to say about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Oh, right. I was going to do the usual disclaimer. Right. So I'm not an expert in everything I do on here, everything I talk about on here, rather. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it eventually, and I do enjoy the feedback.
We do have a viewer who's from Israel.
Ah, cool.
Chat.
I think we had a regular from Israel, or is this a new guy?
I think we have a few regulars from Israel. This is Doomweed. Thanks, Doomweed, for tuning in.
I'm trying not to cough into the mic as requested. Some people were
nice of you. I noticed you were muting. I figured that's what you were doing.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep it under control a little more. I'd actually already been muting, but before I was coughing more because I was talking. Just the more I talked, the more it would happen. And it's kind of hard to catch that sometimes. But over the past week, it's kind of subsided more. So it's a lot less pronounced now. So hopefully it's kind of in the recovery phase. It shouldn't be as much of a problem, in other words.
I'm glad you're getting
We'll see. We'll see how it goes as we go along. Well, there is some stuff going on in Ukraine. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah.
So in this case, it's the Battle of Prokhorov. And that's a town that's, I want to say, west of Donetsk. I don't remember exactly. But it's in Donetsk province, oblast. And the Russians have been pushing relatively hard to try to take it. It's a transportation node. That's why they've been kind of homing in on it. It's a rail center, highway center, etc. And so Ukrainian logistics in Donetsk kind of do use that as a focal point. So if the Russians can take it, it would be fairly disruptive. I don't know that it'll necessarily matter too much if they actually do take it. Because there's been several times over the course of the conflict where the Russians were closing in on this, that, or the other transportation node. And, the loss of it was supposed to be some kind of big catastrophe for the Ukrainians. And then after they lost it, nothing really much changed, right? The trajectory of the conflict largely remained the same. So I'm a little dubious that this is going to be like the big one, where the Ukrainians just suffer some kind of major catastrophic loss. I guess hypothetically it could be such a loss, but at this point I've heard it enough times to just be very skeptical about that. So we'll see. But that is the drama that the reporting has been focusing on. The Ukrainians are set to lose another settlement here. This battle started unfolding after the loss of Avdiivka, which was a major fort city in Donetsk that the Ukrainians have been holding since 2014. Kind of sucked for them to lose it, given that they'd managed to hold on to it for so long, but eventually Russian pressure was just too great. I kind of suspect Ukrainians. I kind of suspect the Ukrainian military didn't really figure that they would be able to hold Pokrovsk, which is why I think they did the whole Kursk campaign. Partly they were hoping, I think, to pull Russian troops away, but it also kind of gives them some land to use in negotiations to maybe get some of the land they're losing at Donetsk back. So I think from the Ukrainian command's perspective, that was a cost benefit. that made more sense than trying to just throw everything they had into defending Prokhorov. So we'll see what happens there. From the analysts I was reading, it's not inevitable that the city will fall, but the Russians are getting closer and closer, and the civilians have been evacuated at this point, so it's not looking great. I did note, looking at the map, that the Russians pushing on Prokhorov are forming a pretty large, juicy salient. So I'm a little interested to see if the Ukrainians can do anything about that. And maybe that they're just too thin on the ground to really do anything in Donetsk at this point but defend, especially given their issues with manpower. But if they can find some reserves, especially some armored units with some speed, they could hypothetically pinch that salient off. That is a viable tactic given the state of the map right now. But we'll see. That's something I'm personally paying attention to. I think if they don't do it, that will kind of confirm some of the reporting we've seen about the difficulties of the Ukrainian army and its ability to recruit and form new units, or at least to maintain enough units in the field that they can take advantage of opportunities like that. Let's see, the other Ukraine news I was reading regarded F-16s, so I don't know if you'd been following it, but they actually did finally receive F-16s, and they have been using them. These are older models. These are like A-B models from the 70s and 80s that have been upgraded over time. So they're not the cutting-edge stuff, but, they are an improvement over, what they've been using. Mostly thus far, they've been using them just for air defense against cruise missiles. They've only just recently got them, so they're using them pretty conservatively until they can get their pilots more experience. So it's a very defensive role they're filling at the moment. As far as cruise missiles, they're actually still relying mostly on ground defenses. The F-16s are basically just a supplement to that. But again, at this point, it's really more about just experience. You want to get the pilots more comfortable with the aircraft. Pretty much all of the pilots that Ukraine has flying F-16s right now are guys that did a crash course in the West to learn how to fly them. And it was a very truncated course, right? Normally, say if you're the American military, you want pilots to have thousands of hours flying before you let them go into a combat situation, right? Before you actually let them deploy actively. Ukraine doesn't have that luxury, so their pilots have like a fraction of that. So they're probably going to be real careful with the F-16s they have and what they do with them for probably months, maybe a year or more, depending on circumstance. I did read that they eventually do want to use them for a ground attack role to try to supplement their ground forces and help them out. But they're probably a long way away from that. So I would not hold my breath on that front. But if they can do that eventually, that'll definitely be a big help. Let's see. Also, people were talking about F-16s partly this past couple days because Ukraine actually lost its first F-16. It was apparently on a sortie against incoming cruise missiles, and something happened. I haven't really heard or read anything that was very clear on exactly what resulted in the loss of the airplane. So the Ukrainian government has been very cagey about that. It's possible it was shot down by Russian surface-to-air missiles, but they haven't really had the range to hit that deep into Ukraine, I think. And even in the cases where there have been Ukrainian aircraft in Ukraine operating that have been within range of Russian SAMs, they've generally been able to see it coming and take evasive action. So probably not Russian SAMs, I would guess. What I read is maybe more likely is that a Ukrainian Patriot surface-to-air missile system may have accidentally shot it down. But again, the Ukrainian government has not commented on that. Right? They have, again, not released any significant details, but given that it's fairly difficult to kind of deconflict enemy aircraft from friendly aircraft in a crowded airspace, it's entirely possible. In the article I read on the BBC, they were saying that there was a number of similar such incidents. I think they said 3 incidents of Patriot missiles accidentally shooting down for the aircraft during the Gulf War back in 1991. So it's hardly unprecedented. And given that Ukraine is much less experienced with handling a crowded airspace and whatnot, that also makes it relatively more likely, I think. So, again, this is all speculation, but given what we know and given circumstances in the conflict, that seems to be the most likely case at the moment. The most likely explanation, rather, at the moment for how the F-16 was lost.
When did you say these older model F-16s were made?
They were originally manufactured in the 70s.
Huh.
Yeah, the F-16 is a fairly old plane at this point. But they were upgraded in the 80s and 90s before they were either retired or sold to for use in foreign countries by foreign air forces. So while they are older models, they are not like they're not the same as they were when they were first used back in the 70s. Like, they do have relatively modern avionics systems.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not cutting edge stuff. It's nothing compared to what, like, the front line, the mainline F-16s that the U.S. Air Force is still using. But they're better than, like, the older MiGs that the Ukrainian Air Force had been using.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those were themselves older models, but their avionics were not as advanced. I was actually reading that these are the first new aircraft that the Ukrainian Air Force has gotten since 1991. So that gives you an idea of what their inventory was like. Let's see, I drew up some things for Ukrainians to look forward to in 2025, because 2024 has kind of been a downer year for them so far. Now, the war has not been going great. No big disasters, per se, but, you know, not a lot of good news either. So, for those of you looking forward to 2025, some things that you can expect. From what I was reading a couple months ago, Western artillery production is supposed to finally reach Russian levels of production by the end of 2024. So in 2025, it's possible that Ukraine could have close to parity with Russian artillery fires. You know, thus far in the conflict, the Russians have managed to outgun the Ukrainians as far as the availability of artillery ammunition. So that's been a big advantage for them. Generally, when the Ukrainians have been able to reach parity, it's been because they've rationed the artillery that they've been able to produce or procure from the West and save it for big offensives. But those offensives have only been able to last for a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, before their ammunition stores started to run out and they had to go back to rationing. So that's kind of the situation they've been in, and so hopefully in 2025 they'll be in a much stronger position and they'll have a much greater ability to deflect Russian offensives without worrying about that big disparity in artillery fires. We already talked about the F-16s. You know, they may be confident enough to start using them for the ground attack role, so you could see Ukrainians start using more of the GPS-guided bombs that the Russians have been using to great effect over the past year. They may finally see some progress on recruiting. You know, again, the whole recruiting crisis kind of really started when they basically fired everybody in their recruiting agency. So hopefully by 2025, they'll be close to having that resolved and they'll be able to get a stronger inflow of new blood into the army. Also, the uncertainty over the political situation in the United States is going to be settled by 2025. One way or the other. We don't entirely know who's going to win at this point, but, you know, all of the questions about who's going to win, what's it going to mean for Ukraine, you're not going to have to worry about that by 2025. You're going to know where you stand, so you can plan accordingly with more confidence and what the Ukrainian relationship with the United States is going to be like for the next 4 years. As far as Ukrainian war production, there should be improvements in 2025. There's a big, you know, evolution going on perpetually as far as drone production in Ukraine. You know, they're constantly pumping out newer and better models. and that production is being ramped up with new factories and foreign investment and whatnot. So that should be improved by 2025 and in 2025. And also, one of the strategies that the Ukrainians had developed in conjunction with Western partners over the past year is that there was a big push to try to get Western defense firms to actually invest in and build facilities in Ukraine, specifically Western Ukraine. So that could start bearing fruit in 2025. If those factories can come online and start producing new vehicles, that should help Ukraine start to better mechanize its army. And also, it should help a lot with repair and recovery of vehicles. Because having, manufacturing facilities for armored vehicles of one kind or another, it's not just about producing new vehicles, it's also about repairing the ones you already have and recovering and restoring ones that have been lost in combat. So that can actually be an important source of vehicles for any given army. So that's a short list of stuff that Ukrainians can hopefully look forward to in 2025, and that will hopefully help them get some better headlines than those they've gotten in 2024 thus far. Oh, there was another Ukrainian item I had. Russia is apparently withdrawing 100 of its paramilitary officers from Burkina Faso. This is the Africa Corps, by the way, formerly known as Wagner Group. They had mercenaries operating in, they have rather, mercenaries operating in West Africa, specifically in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, mainly. I think they're also in the Central African Republic, but that's not really quite West Africa. But anyway, supposedly, Africa Corps is withdrawing some of its officers from Burkina Faso and redeploying them into Ukraine. From what I was reading, supposedly they're going to try to help contain the Ukrainian advance in the Kursk offensive.
Seems like a lot of action going on.
Well, there's always a lot of action going on in Ukraine, but it's just that there's not a lot of change in terms of like the trend. Slow, incremental Russian advance, deal making between Ukraine and the West, uncertainty over the West's position. This is all stuff that's kind of been baked into the status quo in the Ukrainian conflict for a while now. Effectively since the conflict began. So, while there are little developments here and there, by and large, that's still the preeminent status quo. The conflict is probably not going to be won on the battlefield. It's largely going to be decided by the degree to which the West can maintain enough public support to continue supporting the Ukrainian war effort. And if that support can be made longstanding and, more importantly, credibly longstanding, then there will be probably enough pressure on the Russians then to negotiate for some kind of settlement to result. But for now, the Russian government is not convinced that the West is in it for the long haul. The Russian government strategy is basically just to keep the conflict going long enough until the West gets tired and quits. And at that point, they can either push the Ukrainians on the battlefield enough that they maybe not surrender, but agree to favorable terms to a peace agreement, or at least freeze the conflict to some degree and force the Ukrainians into a continuing war of attrition that they effectively just can't win.
Yeah, so a macro game in the sense that it's not decided on a single decisive fight somewhere. It's the cost over time.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So, if I don't talk about Ukraine every week, it's not because, nothing is happening. It's just the overarching trend lines have not really changed. Those are generally the items that I focus more on at this point when I talk about Ukraine.
How is Zelensky's approval?
It's down. It's not as high as it was like early in the war. People are a little critical of how the war is going, how it's been managed. The recruitment situation, the draftee situation, some of the losses on the front are unpopular. there is still war reporting going on in Ukraine, and obviously there's some government censorship, but people know when there's a big defeat, right? They know when they lose Bakhmut, or when they're about to lose a city like, say, the one we were just talking about, Prokharov, or whatever it was. So when stuff like that happens, or when there's like an incident where maybe their soldiers are mistreated, or maybe they're left to die by some incompetent commander, that makes the rounds on the news, and that gets people unhappy. So there's been enough of that Zelensky's popularity has suffered correspondingly. It hasn't collapsed. It's still pretty good. I think it's like 70%, something around there. But it's not at the lofty highs it was like at the first stages of the war. But, not really surprising in the grand scheme of things, right? In the early days, Zelensky very much distinguished himself. But since then, it's kind of hard to distinguish yourself in a war of attrition, right? It's just ugly.
Yeah.
People are not going to like it. Let's see. Oh, did we talk about local German elections?
We did not.
So there's 2 states in Germany that are having elections right now, or at least 2 that I've been reading about, Thuringia and Saxony. And they've been in the news because the AfD is projected to get the most votes in the elections in those 2 states. So for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the AfD, that's the alternative for Deutschland, or alternative for Germany, if you want to anglicize it. That's how do I put this diplomatically?
Racist group?
Yeah, well, that's certainly how their opponents frame them. I've generally referred to them as a far-right political party, but then whenever I do, there's always somebody in chat who says, no, it's not a far-right party. They're mischaracterized by the media. Really, they're just a alternative opposition party, as they frame it. But there's a lot of people on the far right who vote for them. Like a disproportionate share of the voting base is people on the far right. So make of that what you will. Whether that's enough to frame the party as far right or not, I'll leave to the imagination of the listener. Regardless, whenever the AfD does well in Germany politically, it sets off alarm bells in Germany because, of course, in German political culture, there's a big taboo against the far right because of the experience with the Nazis and whatnot. So generally, far right parties have not been able to kind of break the barrier, right? They haven't been able to really get into power, even in the cases where the AfD has managed to do pretty well in the polls, in elections rather. Generally, all of the other parties will kind of band together in whatever coalitions are necessary to keep them out of power. In fact, there was actually a big scandal a couple of years ago in Germany when there was a guy in the CDU, the main conservative party in Germany, who made some statement. He didn't make statements. He ended up voting to remove a sitting, whatever the state equivalent of a prime minister is, like in the local legislature. And he ended up getting the votes of the AfD in that vote. And that was a big shit show because everybody said, oh, well, you actually conspired with the AfD to do that. And that suggested some kind of implicit coalition between the CDU and the AfD. And of course, the CDU said, no, that's not the case at all. We just wanted to vote against this guy. We didn't know the AfD was going to do that. They told us they weren't going to vote with us in that vote, and they lied, and they ended up doing it anyway. And so it was a big thing. That just illustrates how big the taboo is against cooperating explicitly or implicitly with the AfD in German political culture. So the fact that they're winning, it looks like they're going to win the most votes in these state elections, suggests that it'll be relatively harder to form a coalition that does not involve the AfD. It's still going to happen. I think every expectation is that the AfD is going to be excluded. But the fact that the AfD continues to do well in those 2 states illustrates the growing difficulty with keeping them out of power and the tensions within German politics that are seemingly emergent and that the establishment political parties have not been able to contain yet, despite having been trying to do so for more than 10 years now. It's worth pointing out that the AfD succeeding in Thuringia and Saxony does not mean that they're popular to a similar degree in the rest of Germany. Keep in mind that the AfD's principal base of support is in Eastern Germany, right? They don't have nearly as much support in Western Germany. It's still notable, but there's nowhere in Germany where they're more successful than East Germany. These two provinces, or states rather, in particular. So this does not augur some kind of ascendancy for the AfD per se, but it does suggest this particular region of Germany is particularly upset with status quo and is seeking out alternatives. And that does reflect an underlying tension within broader Germany, because even if the AfD isn't as successful in the rest of Germany, there's a lot of people that are very critical of the establishment parties, even outside of Eastern Germany. And that is reflected in the degree to which the AfD has been able to kind of monopolize that dispossessed, well, maybe not dispossessed, but dissenting, upset, disgruntled part of the political spectrum in Germany. So I think the election results have probably been finalized by now. I was reading about it earlier, so it is like happening right now, I think. So I haven't seen what the results are, but I imagine they did pretty well. So that'll be the result of some consternation in German politics for the next week or so, no doubt. I think we talked last time about the guy from Syria who stabbed a bunch of people in Germany at that festival last time. Yeah, so some people were saying that also is feeding into the AfD's success in this election, because it happened right before, right? So that's no doubt going to fire up all the people who are very skeptical about immigration, many of whom vote disproportionately for the AfD because they don't think the establishment parties are actually serious about curbing immigration.
Curbing immigration? Is it stopping it entirely?
I'm sure a lot of people in the AfD would like to stop it entirely, but I don't think that's in their platform, at least not yet. For now, they're just trying to put up barriers to make it more difficult. Fewer asylum seekers, higher barrier to entry, more bureaucracy, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, right, Mexico. We don't talk about Mexico a lot.
Yeah, not a ton.
Actually, we don't really talk about Latin America in general too much. Yeah, so the big item that I read regarding Mexico has been the judicial reform. I don't know if we have anybody from Mexico listening, but that from what I understand, that's the big news item, and has been for a couple weeks now, I guess. So they can confirm that, if they're willing to anyway. I don't know what other big news items there's been. So the judicial reform basically is going to significantly, quote unquote, democratize the judicial branch in Mexico. The idea is to take about 7,000 judge positions, magistrate positions, and other positions involving justices, and have them be directly elected by popular vote. They're also going to lower the required degree of experience to qualify for these positions, and they're also going to reduce the age requirements. They're also going to shrink the size of Mexico's top court, as I understand it. They're also going to switch away. The previous system they had in place was a system of professional exams for these positions. And also in the case of the Supreme Court, as well as for electoral courts, there was a nomination process that would be familiar to people in the United States. The executive nominates them, the legislature confirms them. So they're getting away from that system. The reform would like, in practice, to dispose of that system and replace it with just direct elections. They're also going to change it so that members of a disciplinary tribunal that they want to set up, this is a disciplinary tribunal with regard to justices, people working within the judicial system. So this group would have oversight over them. They're going to give that tribunal the power to punish judges, and they're also going to make the positions on the tribunal directly elected. So a whole lot of democracy here going on, but a lot of people have been critical. Obviously, not supporters of Obrador. Obviously, they're kind of all for it, but opponents of Obrador, shall we say, and his party have been extremely critical here. Because while in principle, direct election of judges might sound like a good idea to some, not everybody, for obvious reasons, but critics have said that this is going to open up Mexico to a whole new level of corruption, right? Because the judiciary has been a major institutional block to Obrador and his people as far as imposing, or well, maybe implementing would be the better word, some of their broader changes, because they tend to have a left-wing, let's say a left populist style of politics. But some of their more dramatic changes have been blocked by the judiciary as unconstitutional, or this, that, or the other. And so Obrador has made it a priority to try to reform, not Obrador, sorry. No, yeah, Obrador has made it a priority to reform the judicial system to try to remove that as a block. And given how popular the populists are in Mexico right now, direct election of judges basically translates to more Obrador supporters in the judicial system, which presumably then means there's going to be much, much less institutional resistance on that front. So if you like Obrador and his policies, you'll get more of those policies going forward if this reform goes through. However, there's also going to be fewer breaks on any kind of overreach by Obrador if this reform goes through. And given that power corrupts people, that's probably not going to be good for the health political system in Mexico going forward. So that's actually been a concern not only for Obrador's opponents. A lot of foreign investors have actually homed in on this and have been very critical. They're afraid that if the judicial system does become politicized, then foreign investments will become targets of expropriation by populist politicians of one kind or another. As of now, Mexico's judicial system is flawed, but it has been protecting the private property of foreign investors to the point where they're fairly confident continuing to invest and maintaining pre-existing investments. But if that confidence is shaken, that could change. That could see significant decline in foreign investment and possibly even pre-existing factories and other investments closing down and potentially relocating someplace else. It's not inevitable. It could be that even if the reform goes through, it doesn't have a big impact on foreign investments, because on the one hand, direct election of populist judges is not going to augur well for the prospects of foreign businesses, if not businesses in general in Mexico. But at the same time, given the problems with corruption in Mexico, it could be that direct election of judges results in very corrupt judges that are very malleable to the extraordinary resources available to foreign corporations operating in Mexico. So in that sense, if the reform goes through, it could be that Mexican justice is actually more subordinate to foreign interests and investment, not less. It just kind of depends on how things shake out and how Obrador and his party kind of want to manage things. Like if they really want to crack down on foreign business, bribery probably won't matter too much. But if they take a more parasitic, exploitative approach to managing foreign investments, bribery in that case could be a big deal, and that could be the shield that protects foreign corporations and allows them to maintain the confidence prerequisite to continuing business in Mexico. So we'll see what happens with that. That could have a dramatic impact on the Mexican economy if it actually does shake corporate confidence. But, my guess is that the status quo will prevail. That's always a safe bet. There's enough corrupt actors in Mexico that I imagine foreign business will find a way to exploit that to their advantage in order to try to secure their position in country. And keep in mind, Mexico has new leadership coming in. Obrador has been president, but he can't run again. And so he's actually going to be replaced by Sheinbaum, I believe her name is. So she is his chosen successor. They're of the same party. So it's not like there's going to be a big change in policy, but Obrador here is still technically president. And what he's doing is trying to rush through constitutional amendments to make this reform, among others, possible. And so that's why this has been in the news recently. This is something he's trying to jam through while he has a major majority and while he's still president. But it could be that his successor, Sheinbaum, is less dramatic. It may be that she doesn't really feel that this is as much of a priority and that it doesn't need to be jammed through, but can be passed in sort of a more normal way. Let's see, some of the other constitutional amendments they're talking about, there's apparently a good number of them, but the three in particular that the article I read homed in on were, one, putting the National Guard under the control of the Defense Ministry. They had actually tried to do that before, but the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional. So having the National Guard under the control of the military is a positive, given that the military has much more of the public's confidence than the National Guard. The National Guard is kind of weaker as an institution. I think it was created specifically by Obrador to deal with crime and the cartels, but it just failed miserably. So this is a good political move in that sense, but it's actually a bad move in terms of institutional health, because this actually significantly expands the power of the military. And Mexico's army has already been expanding its power pretty significantly over the past 10 years at the expense of civilian government. So that's not really a positive change in terms of that trend, which is why critics have been upset by it. Another constitutional amendment eliminating autonomous agencies, including the transparency body and the energy regulator. So I imagine the transparency body in particular is what has people worried here. Having an anti-corruption agency be independent is a major tool in the toolbox of anybody who is interested in anti-corruption activism, right? That was a major achievement for those activists when they were able to get that through, and now it's looking like they're going to just remove it. So obviously, removing that body is going to significantly reduce the barriers to engaging in corruption, and given how corrupt Mexican politics already is, I don't think that augurs well for the either, given all the other things we're talking about, but this also does not augur well for the future health of Mexico's political system.
Would you say that this is at all similar to the exploitation of like soda companies in Mexico, where they can just buy out the entire water reserves of whole villages and use them for foreign products? It's that kind of deal?
No, because that's foreign corporations. This is a political party doing this. These are populists who are of a left-wing bent and are very anti-business and especially anti-foreign business, who are trying to remove judicial opposition to their left-wing agenda.
Ah, I see.
So if anything, it would be less likely that, cola companies would be able to unfairly appropriate water from local villages. If anything, if the government had its way, given its current composition, they would prefer to expropriate the assets of that company and make it harder for them to do business. Let's see. Oh, yeah, the other item here, the other amendment here, they want to ban the state electricity company from partnering with private businesses, which is probably not too big a deal in the grand scheme of things, but it also implies that maybe the government wants the state-owned electricity company to just monopolize the sector and to completely push out private sector operators. So I suspect that's what the opponents there are worried about, the potential marginalization and eventual destruction of the private energy sector. Some of this stuff actually violates USMCA, which is the trade treaty that the Trump administration negotiated to replace NAFTA. I think specifically, basically de facto nationalizing the electricity sector in particular is going to be something that gets some attention, probably legal attention. So I'm not sure how this is going to work out. If two things happen, one, if whatever administration takes power in the United States after the next presidential election decides that Mexico is full-throated violating the USMCA and wants to use that as an excuse to significantly curtail trade with Mexico, either to punish Mexico and coerce it into compliance with the USMCA, or just to erect trade barriers to appeal to populist political sentiment in the United States, there is potential there for significant disruption to U.S.-Mexico trade with corresponding knock-on effects to supply chains in the United States. So the other thing that could happen then is that confidence, the business confidence among foreign investors could be significantly knocked, depending on what the Mexican government, well, whether or not the reform even happens, but then also if what the Mexican government does with the power that will be granted with all of these constitutional amendments if they pass. So if those two things happen at once, if both foreign investors lose confidence in Mexico as an investment locale, and the government comes to power in the United States that decides to significantly retaliate against some of these changes that are being made, that could represent a significant threat to the status quo as far as U.S.-Mexico trade. And there is potential for that. There is potential there for tit-for-tat escalation to result that eventually just destroys the trading relationship and effectively undoes the USMCA treaty, with, again, significant knock-on effects for U.S. supply chains, because given how ingrained U.S. manufacturers are in northern Mexico, having to suddenly and over a short term remake those supply chains outside of Mexico, perhaps inside the United States or some other country that the United States has a trade treaty with, that would be very disruptive. That would create supply chain issues in the United States that would probably exacerbate inflation. And that, of course, would have knock-on effects for, whoever is in power, politically speaking, as well as just squeezing, the average working man, who has already been squeezed pretty significantly over the past 4 or 5 years. So there's potential for fireworks there. But at the same time, the caveat here is that people have been saying that there's potential for fireworks in the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship since Trump was elected back in 2016. And while there has been tensions and changes that have increased the barriers to trade between the U.S. and Mexico, the trading relationship has managed to weather all of that. So even with those tensions, it has not collapsed. So while there is potential here for significant escalation, that's been true for a while. So at this point, it may be a little bit Chicken Little to say that this is the time that the sky is actually falling. In reality, this could just be another storm that both parties end up weathering, and a couple years from now, it'll be like it never happened. But if it does escalate, keep in mind there is potential there for significant disruption.
Interesting.
I had a funny side note on this one. So a Mexican judge apparently ordered the lower house of Congress in Mexico not to discuss the reform, specifically the judicial reform, which I thought was kind of a power move on their part. Obviously, the judges are dead set opposed against the judicial reform. They prefer the status quo. However, while the judge did issue this order to not talk about it to the legislature, specifically the lower house, the lower house apparently, the legislature in general, apparently has a history of ignoring orders like this. So apparently judges can tell the legislator not to talk about something, but the legislature in turn can just totally ignore that and do it anyway. So it's looking like this little power struggle doesn't actually matter that much, at least in terms of whether or not the legislature can actually talk about it. In turn, and I found this humorous as well, there was a district judge in Chiapas, a state of Mexico, who ruled in favor of judges who had challenged the judicial reform. These are people who didn't want, the legislature to vote on it, basically saying that it was unconstitutional. So this judge ordered a stop to the reform. Specifically, he wanted it not to be sent to the state legislatures for approval. So, the national legislature could approve it, but he wanted to ban it from being sent to state legislatures for approval, because that's the process for constitutional amendments. So then the leader of Obrador's party, I think it's called Morena, their leader in the lower house, said that he would totally just ignore that ruling. If the legislature does actually pass the constitutional amendment, he's just going to ignore that judge's ruling and send it to the state legislatures for further and final approval. So basically, judges in Mexico do have some independence, but when it comes to legislators, they apparently just ignore them. They just have no power. We don't want you to do this, we don't want you to do that, and the response from the politician is, fuck you, I'm going to do that anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's not the healthiest status quo for a political system. You want people to respect your judicial system, because the judicial system, again, does not have a lot of mechanisms by which it can enforce its rulings. It very much depends on the other two branches of government to respect its rulings. And Whether or not they do is purely down to political norms, right? It's very difficult to force people to respect those norms if they have enough power not to. I think we've talked at length about political culture and norms and the value therein. So this
Yeah,
is
it's
an
a very
example.
strong point of inertia, but it's very slow to change.
Yeah. So this is an example of what it looks like when you have bad political norms and weak institutions. Like powerful political actors can just straight up ignore court rulings, and there's no consequence for it. I would point out that after the recent elections in Mexico, Morena, the populist party, has a clear-cut majority, in fact, a supermajority in the lower house of the legislature. They do not have a majority in the Senate, the upper house of their legislature. They're one seat short of a majority. But the supermajority in the House is going to be enough to pass the constitutional amendments, and if they pass the state legislatures in turn, they're going to become law. And it's looking likely that that's going to happen at this juncture anyway. Another interesting and humorous side note, the U.S. Embassy in Mexico normally keeps very quiet about Obrador and some of his shenanigans that he and his party have been up to the past 5 to 10 years or so. But in the case of this recent change, specifically the judicial reform, the head of the embassy actually did speak out against it and say that it threatened the trade relations between U.S. and Mexico. And Obrador, for his part, couldn't really let that go. But he also didn't really want to challenge the United States to like an open confrontation over it. So he ended up kind of striking an interesting middle ground. He said that he was going to pause relations with the U.S. and Canadian embassies in Mexico because of their criticisms over the judicial reform. However, he also said that the pause was only with the embassies and not with the countries themselves. So he's kind of trying to have it both ways. He's trying to send the signal that he's displeased with how the embassies have come out against his reform, but he's also trying to pacify the governments that those embassies represent by saying that he doesn't have a problem with the countries. It's just some of the specific people in the embassies in question that he has an issue with, which I found hilarious because that's not how embassies work. That's, of course, they're representatives of the government. So if you crack down on them somehow, you are effectively cracking down on the governments they represent. So you can't have it both ways.
No, you sent us specifically bad people, but the rest of your country's fine. But those specific people,
Yeah, that's not going to work. I mean, if the embassy personnel does something like explicitly illegal or egregious, then yeah, you can kind of do that. In that case, you can arrest them or force them to leave, what have you. There are rules and norms in place to govern that kind of situation. But in this case, the embassy was very clearly expressing the position of the U.S. government. So in that case, you can't really just pick, you can't really nitpick and say, okay, well, that position is just the position of some guy at the embassy. Surely it's not the position of the U.S. government. At that point, you're really just trying to have your cake and eat it too. So the reality of the situation is that there is tension now on account of that. We'll see where it goes. That's another story to keep your eye on. But for now, it's kind of on a low boil until we actually see if the judicial reform really happens.
cool. We did have some questions passed along as well.
Oh, okay. Let's see. You have alluded to 2025 for the Ukrainians depending on Western support. Do you think if Trump is elected that there will be an attempt to withdraw aid from the Ukrainian war effort or from NATO? It's not from NATO. I don't think Trump, if elected, is going to withdraw from NATO. I think he'll pressure other NATO members to increase spending, probably specifically on American equipment, if I know Trump. But I don't think he'll leave either. But the Ukrainian war effort, that's a different animal. I don't think he sees as much room for profit there. Yeah, I think, though, it's not inevitable that a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, rather, would withdraw support from Ukraine. I think it would really depend on context and circumstances. Right? It's going to depend on how much pressure Congress puts on them to continue supporting Ukraine, and it's going to depend on the ability of Ukrainian diplomats to negotiate directly with Trump and his new administration if it comes to pass. They should already be reaching out to the Trump campaign, even before the election, to try to establish some kind of rapport and relationship so that they can have some kind of foundation to work from as far as negotiating continued support if he is reelected. It may be that he just wants to end it regardless. In that case, there's not much you can do. But I've never known Trump to be particularly convicted. Well, that's not quite the right word. I've never known him to hold very strong convictions in the time that he's been involved in politics. He's generally been pretty mercenary and transactional as far as the positions he's had. We've actually seen that just in the past week. He was in the news for saying that he was going to vote in an upcoming referendum, I think, in Florida, in favor of, what was it? Oh, he was going to vote against abortion restrictions. That's what he said. He has come out several times and said that like a full ban on abortion is bad politics and he doesn't want to do it. So he came out and said that he was going to vote against that position, but then a whole bunch of his supporters, especially on the religious right, came out against him and were very upset with him. And in response to that, he actually changed his position and said that he would vote in favor of the provision. So I think Ukraine could take advantage of that. I don't think he's like dead set on cutting support to Ukraine. I think he just wants to send a signal specifically to his supporters that he's doing things to curtail America's involvement abroad. But it's possible that signal could be entirely superficial and that Ukraine could negotiate further support, so long as it's done in a sufficiently low-key way that Trump could not be accused of, propagating the war just like the previous administration was. So, that's a lot of ifs and caveats. It kind of depends on variables that we can't predict. But again, that's why I'm saying that I don't think it's inevitable that Trump withdraws support. It's going to be dependent on other variables. I certainly think there's going to be a big risk that he does. I don't think if Harris is elected, for example, that there's going to be any significant risk of a cutoff there, unless there's some kind of drama in Congress that undermines support. But with Trump, much more of an uncertain proposition. We'll see in that case. Let's see. Curious on my thoughts about Peter Zahan, another Zahan question. Zahan's main talking point is that globalism is dying because America is going to allow it to die, and they were the only ones really propping it up so far. Second main talking point is that most countries like China, Korea, Japan, most of Europe, to name a few, are way beyond the point of no return birth rate-wise, and that at some point they'll be mostly irrelevant, further dooming globalism. I remember I at one point said that globalism is inevitable. Oh yeah, I remember that. I got some heat for that in the YouTube comments. What does Agent Smith think about the Zahan in general? Totally wrong. Anything to be taken seriously there at all? Yeah, there is kind of a cottage industry of geopolitical experts, quote unquote. Some of them are better than others. Zahan makes interesting points from what I've seen of him. But I also don't feel I can fully judge him, given that I haven't actually sat down and read through any one of his books. I've seen some of his seminars. He's talked a lot, so I have seen some of that. So most of what I know about him, I've gleaned from those videos. But I feel like I would need to really sit down and read before I just completely cast judgment on the guy. But that said, as far as the specific points that were raised here. Zahan thinks globalism is dying because the United States is going to allow it to die. That's not going to happen. Globalism is not something that entirely depends on the United States. At this point, the structure of the global economy kind of makes it really hard not to have a globalized economy.
See the Belt and Road project we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's part of it too. But even beyond that, it's just so much more efficient to trade globally for stuff that you need or want, that if you don't do it, you're actually kind of handicapping your economy. I think that was the point I was raising when I said globalism is inevitable. You can cut yourself off from trade, but the consequence over the medium to long term of doing that is that your economy is going to be progressively less competitive, and you're going to have more and more problems maintaining economic growth. So over time, eventually, that's going to create a dilemma where you're going to either maintain the status quo and just get worse and worse off economically, or you're going to reverse course and eventually open up to trade again to some degree in order to try to take advantage of the unique opportunities provided by a globalized economy, to try to rejuvenate your economy and participate in the global trade networks that power the global economy. So it's inevitable in the sense that the underlying math and rationale and cost-benefit analysis of global trade makes it the optimal outcome. It's like the best choice you can make, just in terms of what's best for your economy. Now, I grant that some of what's best for an economy, quote unquote, is subjective. There is room to maneuver there. I think we are seeing that happen now as far as the curtailing of global trade. There has been some move away from it, in so much as there have been barriers erected to global trade. But those barriers are not, what's the word I want? Those barriers are porous, right? If you've been paying attention to the Sino-American relationship, and specifically the trading relationship, even with all of the barriers to trade that have been erected there, trade between China and the United States has actually not been significantly affected by that. Like, trade flows are largely continuing as they were. They're just continuing now through third parties so that Chinese companies can engage in tariff evasion. So it's very difficult in practice at this point to actually contain global trade, just because there's so much interconnectivity between so many different actors now. So it's just very hard to unwind that, like, from an administrative capacity perspective. Like, states can't really do that. A lot of what we've seen as far as curtailing trade has actually just been political theater. That's largely just, what's the word I want? Diverted trade, rather than destroy it. So it's not really that there's a whole lot less global trade now. It's more that it's taken on a different composition in response to government stimuli, trying to influence it. So that's what I mean when I say, globalism is inevitable. Like, just the underlying math makes it like that in terms of, like, public policy choices and outcomes.
There are
So that's why
ethical considerations that aren't directly economical, but things like working conditions of the countries that you're buying stuff from. I agree with you completely in the sense that, yeah, well, it's cheaper to still get the parts from there, but as consumers are informed about certain stuff and working conditions change, it's just one of those things to consider when it comes to getting overseas labor or goods.
that's true. I'm not opposed to, making efforts to try to improve working conditions abroad, but what you're going to find is that's very difficult.
Yeah.
Right. The political economies of different countries, especially in the developing world, are such that there's an immense amount of institutional opposition, especially among economic elites, to implementing the kind of reforms that would be necessary to improve labor conditions. And you can try to impose conditions, you can put clauses in trade treaties, you can have NGOs try to do things like fair trade, quote unquote, where they have inspectors actually go to different countries and try to verify whether or not things are being done in a fair way. But the reality is that the economic incentives for producers in those countries, again, specifically amongst the elites, are very, very strong. So much so, let me clarify that. The economic incentives facing economic elites in the developing world in particular are with regard to ignoring that stuff and evading that stuff, evading those efforts to ensure fair trade, are so strong, and the ability to enforce it on the part of developed world actors is so weak that it's pretty much inevitable that all of those efforts are going to fail. You can make improvements on the periphery, on the margin, but actually doing substantive improvements is really going to require political changes in the developing world. It's not something you can really impose from without. Consumers have some discretion and power to influence economic operations in foreign countries, and that has been used to some effect. But ultimately, you're not going to change the underlying political economy over there, and until you do that, you're not really going to see fundamental improvements in labor conditions. So I agree completely that there are subjective considerations in affecting trade policy, but again, like I said, we've already seen that, and most of it has just been political theater. It has not really been designed to have a substantive impact. It's been designed to make people think that governments are taking action on this, that, or the other issue that is paramount in trade policy, without actually significantly inconveniencing any of the elite actors that are involved in that trade. So that very much characterized the Trump administration's trade policy, and it's continued to characterize trade policy in the United States since then. And I don't see any reason to think it's going to change either, regardless of who wins the next presidential election. So I disagree with Zehan, basically, that globalism is going to die because America is going to allow it to die. America is not actually turning against globalism, right? Zehan implicitly assumes that it is with that argument, and I fundamentally disagree on that point. So globalism is not going to go away. The other talking point you mentioned, birth rates being at a point of no return for East Asian economies and Europe. That's not really a problem, honestly. It's a problem as far as generating economic growth, because demographics are an important variable there as far as economic growth. But underpopulation, I would argue, is actually a preferable economic problem to overpopulation. India right now has an overpopulation problem, and they have for a while. And actually, back during the mid-20th century, trying to curtail birth rates in India was a major public policy priority for successive governments. Because even though the Indian economy in that time was growing pretty strongly, it was not growing fast enough to keep up with population growth. So even as the economy was doing much better after independence, conditions for the average people continued to get worse because they just could not keep up. There were just too many people entering the economy every year, and not enough jobs and other economic opportunities were waiting for them when they did. And that's a problem that's continued to plague them. I mean, birth rates have gone down, and that's alleviated the pressure, but even today, India just has not reached a point yet where it can really significantly, where it can generate significant enough economic opportunities for its people to meet that population growth. And it's still growing relatively fast. It's down from what it was back in like the 50s, but still relatively high. So that's going to be a big public policy problem going forward, especially now that most of the arable land has already been settled. Keep in mind, India's urban-rural divide is still pretty close to 50-50. So as large as India's cities are right now, they're set to get even larger if there is mass urbanization in India's economy over the next couple decades. You know, that's just how rural the Indian economy largely still is. But again, you know, if there is significant population growth, a lot of that is going to be rural, and there's not really much land left for people to till. You know, most of what's left is pretty bad land, and it needs a significant amount of input in terms of things like pesticides and fertilizer and, you know, all manner of other technology that just gets more expensive the worse the land is. So India is about to hit a wall unless they can do significant economic reforms to urbanize the economy and generate more jobs. They're in trouble over the long term. Not in the next couple decades, but like 50 to 100 years time span, it's going to be a problem. And it's not really clear how that resolves itself. So that, I would argue, is a worse position to be in than not having enough workers, because even if you don't have enough workers to continue to generate a lot of economic growth, per capita, your GDP is not going to decline. Like, the conditions for the average person are not necessarily going to get worse because you don't have enough jobs for people. You know, if anything, if you're a native of a country that has a worker shortage, you're actually doing better with a worker shortage because that means you get higher wages. So yes, not great for the overall trajectory of the economy and economic growth and technological innovation, but for the average person, much more livable than living in a country where there's not enough opportunities and too many people. So I would disagree with Zehan that this is like a major economic catastrophe for the countries with low birth rates. That's actually a much more manageable position to be in, and I think they can do that. And they have allowed more immigration, relatively speaking, increasingly so over the past 10 years, so it's not as though they're not trying to meet some of that unmet demand. But a lot of that unmet demand has been in things like healthcare and whatnot. You know, it's very limited, basically. It's very targeted in very specific industries that have notable shortages that people in those countries, you know, especially like Japan, have not been either able or perhaps are not willing to meet. And I don't think that's going to significantly increase. You know, again, I think the more people immigrate to countries like that that have traditionally been homogenous, the more political discord there's going to be. That's been the general pattern. Like, diversity is great, but at the same time, it can't be denied that, you know, the more multicultural a society gets, the more political instability you get, especially from the far right in a given country. They tend to be especially aggravated by that. And I haven't seen any magic public policy bullet that's been able to resolve that particular issue. So I suspect Japan is going to slow walk immigration reform, as well as other countries with low birth rates. I think that's not really going to be like a viable solution going forward to labor shortages. But again, I think the resulting lack of economic growth and other similar such problems that result from labor shortages are more manageable. They can spend money on this, that, or the other. They can improve quality of life for the people who are available. The workers they do have. And as far as things like support for the elderly, I think we've talked before about that and about how that's something that they'll probably just end up kind of ignoring low key. Obviously, countries like China and Japan and whatnot have a lot of respect for elders, but I would also point out that traditionally those cultures also have a lot of regard for state authority. And if the state says that we don't have the resources to take care of you guys in your old age anymore because there's too many of you and the economy's not growing fast enough, I suspect when the rubber meets the road on that, people will just comply. And the overall quality of life for the elderly will decline, and there will not then be a major political backlash because everybody will understand why and will just internalize it as normal. And I would point out that's already happening to a degree already. I think I talked about this the last time we talked about this particular topic, but I saw a documentary on Japan, and they talked about how there's a huge number of elderly people in Japan who basically just die alone without anybody knowing. Like, they just don't really maintain ties with their children or relatives, or maybe they just never had children. And, rather than raising a big stink about how their living conditions are not great and the government needs to do more, a lot of them just wither away. Like, they literally just allow themselves to just kind of die alone. So that implies to me that it is quite possible for governments to deal with the exploding elderly population with some hard-nosed policy choices that are not going to be favorable to those elderly populations.
Well, it's a relatively new burden as well because people didn't used to live this long.
Yeah.
You have to have some innovations in diet and modern medicine and stuff to have a lot of people making it past 80. Historically speaking, that was very rare. You had to be like an aristocrat who was very well protected and had access to the best medicine of the time, or just be extremely lucky.
Yeah, it's a tough position.
I have the solution. Robots will help us do the stuff.
Yeah, the Japanese have been looking into that, but progress has been kind of slow. And they're still relatively expensive. If you're like an older guy living on a farm in rural Japan, can you afford a robot to take care of you in your old age? Probably not, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, that's actually another thing happening in Japan. A lot of the rural areas are hollowing out. I think the average age of farmers in Japan is like 80 years old, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a problem. Not a lot of people want to be farmers in Japan, so they're going to get squeezed on that before too long. They're going to have to find a solution to that.
Yeah, in 2022, the average age of people farming in Japan was 68.4, but it increased significantly throughout the past decade. It used to be 66.2, so it is going up there. I think it was the anime Psycho-Pass that I watched. It's like a futuristic sci-fi mystery thriller kind of thing, and they had a few scene cuts like outside of the cities to these huge fields, and all of it was done by automated farming. So that's at least how the anime artists envision it, is giant robotic tractors doing shit, and then city people get to benefit.
Yeah, I could see that. Most agricultural produce in the United States is currently produced by corporate farms, as I understand it. So yeah, you could see something similar emerge in Japan. Japan has gone out of its way to provide lots of public policy supports for its farmers, so that it can maintain capacity in terms of agricultural production. But without farmers, none of that's going to matter. So they may end up having to shift models there and send more support to encourage the emergence of something like a Japanese corporate farm. I'm sure they already have some, but they're going to need more if they want to try to maintain the capacity that they currently have in reserve, as maintained by the increasingly elderly population of Japanese farmers.
Mm-hmm.
People do be getting pretty old.
Well, let's see. So there was a follow-up question. Zehan's main argument for it dying is that global free trade to totally work requires an adequate world police to avoid piracy, things like that. And he thinks that few other states can actually support a world where that is possible to the extent that the USA can. Is it totally BS? He's totally correct. Many a time I have heard a Zehan point and thought, oh, he's totally right, and then heard him follow up that point with some overly dramatic, accentuated bullshit. So Zehan is totally right that yes, global trade does require some kind of global police. Maybe that's a global hegemon providing naval protection for sea lanes. Maybe it's some kind of international co-op in the form of maybe a UN security force. There are alternatives to a global hegemon, but thus far we've only seen maritime security globally, global maritime security, be a public good provided by hegemons, specifically the United States, and then before the United States did it, the British Empire. So yeah, I think that is an important prerequisite, but the point of disagreement I have with Zehan here is that he thinks that the United States is less and less willing to provide that public service and eventually will stop. And like I said before, I don't think that's true at all. The US government has signaled that it's less interested in doing it, but if you actually look at what the US does in terms of foreign policy and in terms of global maritime security, they're still doing the exact same shit they've always done. Nothing has really changed on that front. There's the Houthis, sure. They're using drones and whatnot to disrupt trade through the Suez Canal by attacking shipping going through the Red Sea. But keep in mind that this is an election year, and no candidate for president wants the public in the United States to think that they're even remotely interested in fighting yet another war in the Middle East. So what's happening right now is that the U.S. government, specifically the Biden administration, pretty much working on behalf of Harris's campaign at this point, probably more so than Biden, has been very reluctant to get more involved in Yemen as far as trying to retaliate against the Houthis. But after the election, the calculus is going to change. And my suspicion is that once the election is over, probably regardless of who wins, I think both Trump and Harris are probably going to be of similar mind. As far as the Houthis, there's probably going to be a crackdown, and you're probably going to see fairly significant escalation roll out in the months after the inauguration of the new president. So I don't think they'll necessarily do it super high profile. They may just do it on the down low. You may barely hear about it, but the Houthis will probably feel it. I feel like there's going to be a lot more targeting of Houthi facilities going forward. Once the election is over, there's not going to be nearly the same paranoia about public backlash, to Middle Eastern involvement. Doesn't mean I think the United States will actually get involved in a war in Yemen. At least not any more than it has been, off and on intermittently over the past 10 years. But I do think, there is a sense that the United States needs to do something about, the safety of that sea lane running through the Red Sea, and that they are going to be more proactive about it. I would point out too that, even if they don't, that's not a super big deal. Circumnavigating Africa, avoiding the Suez Canal, that's a problem. Sure, that adds lots of time and money, but it's also something you can plan around if you know to expect it. The thing about global shipping is that it's fast enough now that adding an extra week, while inconvenient, can be planned around such that it minimizes disruption. The principal problem with the Houthis is not so much that they disrupted shipping, it's that nobody expected it, and so that fucked up everybody's timetables. When new timetables come in, you know how to plan around it, so it's not as big a deal. It's kind of like interest rates right now. Everybody's been complaining about high interest rates, but historically they're not actually that high. And the degree of disruption to the economy caused by interest rate hikes over the past couple of years has actually not been all that dramatic. It's probably been the most pronounced in the housing sector, but if you look at general economic activity, baseline economic theory would suggest there would have been much more disruption. in terms of entrepreneurship, new firms forming, lending, all of that stuff should have been much more curbed and curtailed than it actually was over the past couple of years, which suggests that, theory about interest rates and their relationship with the economy definitely needs exploration and updating. Established theory is not explaining that behavior that we've seen in the data over the past couple of years very well at all. Got a little sidetracked by the economics. To get back to Zehan, I do not think at all that the United States is actually going to stop providing maritime security for the global seaways. They'll signal that they're not going to do it. And in the case of the Houthis, fine, they haven't been as active as they usually are, but that's very, very far from fully withdrawing from the sea lanes. I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't see any significant evidence that it actually will. There's too many incentives to stay involved. Providing that public good provides too much leverage to the United States to just give it up. And the United States itself would stand to lose economically, because the United States is itself effectively a maritime nation with significant ties, significant trade ties, over maritime sea lanes to much of the world.
What are the benefits of us doing that?
Providing public security on global sea lanes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I just mentioned, there's the trade benefit. Obviously, it's going to be much more expensive, difficult, maybe even impossible in some cases to transit goods from the United States to trade partners if the sea lanes are not secure. So we benefit from greater trade, greater exports, access to imports that we want or need. All of that is beneficial economically. In terms of national security, well, I should say in terms of global security, policing those sea lanes discourages states from trying to block trade for their own benefit and to place pressure on rival states. So in that sense, it removes a vector of international conflict. Speaking narrowly in terms of national interest in the United States, that's beneficial in so much as the United States has vested interests in, has treaty commitments to defend certain states around the world. So in so much as we have treaty commitments to defend Europe, Japan, East Asia, and informal commitments, shall we say, to defend Saudi Arabia and Israel, inhibiting the likelihood of international conflict breaking out because of disruptions to trade is beneficial to the United States, because it makes it much less likely that the United States will end up having to fight a conflict in turn to defend those allied states. So there's another benefit.
Proactive stability.
Yeah, proactive ability. So the third benefit then is that providing that public good provides the United States with leverage, because hypothetically, well, not hypothetically, the United States is the only country right now that has the capacity to project force that is sufficient to actually police the entire sea lane, to police all of the sea lanes on the planet. Nobody else can do that. So what that means is, well, two things. One, it means that we have leverage because we can threaten to stop providing that security if a state does not cooperate. So that's kind of an implicit threat that is, omnipresent in America's relations with pretty much all countries, but especially those countries that sit astride sea lanes and that are major trade nodes in the global system of trade. The other benefit that it gives the United States is that because the United States is the only country that is not only policing sea lanes, but is actually physically present there, it's much easier for us to credibly threaten a given state with a blockade. If there's a state that does something we don't like, we already have forces in place to completely cut them off from global trade, or at least global maritime trade. Obviously, that's probably most relevant with regard to China right now. So, if China does something that the United States really, really doesn't like, say, invade Taiwan, hypothetically, the U.S. Navy would be in a position to cut off trade from China. Mind you, we do not have to actually blockade China physically, within 100 kilometers of the Chinese coastline, right? There are a number of choke points on maritime sea lanes that lead to China. It would be enough just to sit on those. The United States Navy could require cargo ships to tell them where they're going. And that would not be especially legal, but there's also not anything anybody could really do to stop it. And also, with ISR capabilities being what they are, that basically reconnaissance capabilities, it's possible for the U.S. Navy to track where ships are going in the South China Sea, for example, and if they catch them on a course to China, they could be intercepted. And mind you, you don't have to stop all ships from getting to China to significantly fuck up their economy, right? Trade is not as important to China's economy as it used to be, but it's still fairly important, especially to the economy of certain provinces, like, say, Guangdong in southern China. So even if you're only preventing like half the ships that were going to China before from actually going there with your quasi-blockade, that's still going to have a significant economic impact. Especially given that China is still fairly dependent on imports of things like oil, coal, and the other one. Forget what the other one was. But there's a couple items that they actually do import a lot of. And if you cut them off from free trade or even significantly curtail their ability to import that stuff, it'll have significant knock-on effects. So that itself is a good reason for the United States to continue to maintain that public service, because providing that public good, rather, in the form of secure maritime sea lanes requires the presence of U.S. Ships and other assets, other military assets that can serve the dual purpose of giving you leverage over other countries, either by way of threat of withdrawing protection of trade in that area, or in terms of threatening a blockade, either a complete blockade or a partial blockade.
You said other countries don't have the ability to do that. Is it just because they don't have enough boats or something else?
Well, I wouldn't have necessarily put it like that, but yes, not enough boats is in fact the big reason. Nobody else can have a carrier battle group, can have multiple carrier battle groups simultaneously deployed in multiple regions of the world at the same time. In fact, I don't think anybody else even has multiple carrier battle groups at this point. And that's to say nothing of amphibious assault ships and their battle groups. So between them, the United States has an immense ability to be present pretty much everywhere at the same time, if need be. I think the UK has one carrier, and I don't think that they have enough ships for like a full battle group. I think maybe a smaller battle group. France has a single carrier at this point. Thailand has an aircraft carrier somehow, but I don't think they have even remotely enough resources for like a full battle group, so it's mostly for show. Japan totally does not have aircraft carriers, but they do have helicopter carriers that look suspiciously like full-sized aircraft carriers. So make of that what you will. But they don't have very many of them, and they're not designed to be the center of carrier battle groups, right? They're just designed mostly for anti-submarine warfare. So
Those aren't explosives. It's mining equipment. Mining equipment. That's right. We wouldn't want to rob you of your right to have mining equipment that is very, very potent.
Exactly. Yeah, lots of that going on in Japan.
So aircraft carriers are fucking expensive.
Very. I think a carrier battle, the amount of maintenance, I should say the cost of a carrier battle group for a year is $1 billion.
Wow.
And that doesn't even get into the cost of actually buying and manufacturing, right, the aircraft carrier. I guess you don't have to manufacture it yourself, but generally you do, just because you get that extra economic activity from having an active shipyard. But even if you just want to buy it from somebody else, it's going to be enormously expensive. It's not cheap. Mm-hmm. And keep in mind, you can't just buy an aircraft carrier. You also need ships around it to provide support. Now, hypothetically, you could just ignore the aircraft carrier and go for smaller capital ships. Like you could go for like a cruiser-centric force, maybe more submarines, that kind of stuff. But even that stuff is going to be expensive, and it also will require you to secure facilities to maintain and refuel those ships. So one of the benefits the United States has is not just that it has enough boats, for example, to have ships all over the world at the same time, all at once. Another major advantage the United States has is that it has pre-existing relationships with countries all over the world that allow the U.S. Navy to have port of call pretty much whenever it needs in any given region. So, if you're a ship in the Middle East, you can have you can go call at Doha in Qatar, or a similar port in an allied state in the region.
Real quick, what's the definition of port of call?
If you want like a full technical definition, I'm the wrong guy to ask. I don't have a super I'm not super trained in like naval terminology. My understanding is that a port of call is a port that you have free access to.
Gotcha.
So, most navies around the world cannot just like show up at a port in another country. Like, you kind of have to get advanced permission. But if you have an agreement in place with another country, then, your ships can come and go as they please.
Oh,
That
so it's
doesn't-
like in Star Wars whenever they hijack an Imperial ship and they have to pretend like they're allowed to do that.
Something like that, similar, yeah. But the United States also has the added advantage of having treaty allies. So, even if a country allows your ship to come and visit a port, that doesn't necessarily mean that port has the facilities to actually refuel or repair your ship. They may not even allow you to do that, even if they allow you to actually arrive in the port. So by having treaty allies and special military arrangements with those treaty allies, not only can the United States Navy visit pretty much, not only does the United States Navy have the benefit of having ports it can visit whenever it wants in any given region, generally there are facilities there, frequently military bases, that have the necessary equipment, expertise, and resources to actually help maintain those ships and allow them to actually stay deployed out abroad, in different parts of the world without having to come all the way back to the United States to refuel and refit. So that itself is a major advantage that no other country has. Hypothetically, another country could try to cultivate relationships with enough countries in enough different parts of the world to replicate that, but it would be enormously expensive, and a lot of countries don't really have an incentive to do that. With the United States, we can credibly say that if a country agrees to do business with, well, I shouldn't say do business, but agrees to allow us access to ports and agree to a military mutual defense agreement of some kind, then we can actually back that up. Honduras cannot do that, right? Honduras maybe wants to have some kind of agreement that would allow its navy to operate in East Asia, but there's not much reason to do that from the perspective of East Asian countries, right? Honduras cannot credibly claim that its navy can take advantage of that agreement if they had it. So why bother? I mean, if you're Honduras, you wouldn't bother in the first place, So if you're the United States, then you have the heft to do that, and you have good enough relations with those states to make it attractive. China hypothetically could do that. Its naval construction has increased significantly, but its relations abroad are not that great, and everybody kind of knows that, if they agree to allow the Chinese Navy access to a base or a port or whatever, then the United States is going to interpret that as them picking a side. And I think everybody knows what the United States did to countries that it perceived as picking the wrong side during the Cold War.
For those who don't, what did they do?
Violence, to put it one way. Lots of coups, lots of espionage, subterfuge, pressure in terms of trade, supporting proxy conflicts by way of rebels or mercenaries. The Cold War was very violent. There was never World War III, right? Violence between the Soviet Union and the United States never broke out, but pretty much the entire world was just a mass of proxy conflicts, and many of them killed significant numbers of the local population. So nobody wants to return to that, and thus far China has not really been sufficiently ambitious in terms of its foreign policy to kind of trigger a significant American response like that. But everybody is kind of aware that if the Chinese Navy does actively try to secure a base abroad, then Washington will have some kind of significant response. And odds are it's going to be pretty violent, much more so than anything the United States has done since the Cold War has ended. Obviously, the Iraq War happened, but that wasn't like implicit pressure because of competition with China. That was a direct invasion, largely because of bullshit reasons. It's a whole other topic of conversation. But Cold War style maneuvering, that very much did not characterize the War on Terror era. It's a very different sort of playbook there. So that's the kind of implicit threat that underlines competition with China. You can align more with China, but if you do so in a military sense, you're kind of taking a risk. And I think most countries are not interested in doing that. And I would say, again, that hypothetically, China could probably make it happen anyway, right? They could probably pay off the right people. They've got enough money, right? Their economy is strong enough. They have enough economic influence over trade partners to lean on them. So between bribery and economic influence, they could probably engineer that if they really wanted to. Maybe they don't have enough confidence right now that whatever arrangement they made would survive American retaliation. If the Chinese are going to do it, then the CIA is going to do it, right? If they're bribing people, the CIA is going to bribe people. And eventually, even if the bribery doesn't work for the CIA, they have other options. Again, violence, if you remember the Cold War. So I think reticence on the part of partners and then lack of confidence on the part of Chinese intelligence agencies may be the principal block there. Hypothetically, that could change in future, but for now, it's not really a factor. Everybody is still kind of behaving themselves. But yeah, only the United States has, one, enough ships to credibly promise and to actually deliver on promises to protect global seaways. And then the United States is also the only country that has extensive enough relationships around the world to maintain large forces in the field, or I guess I should say in the water around the world, for extended periods of time, such that those promises can be credible. So that's a difficult 1-2 punch to match. It's a heavy lift for even the strongest of countries. And keep in mind that it's taken the United States over half a century to do that stuff, like building all those diplomatic relationships, building all of those ships, maintaining them, like all of that stuff has taken expertise that has been cultivated over more than half a century.
And
so
taxpayer
that kind
dollars.
Sorry, what?
And taxpayer dollars.
And taxpayer dollars. But, China has the taxpayer dollars too. They can match that. Mm-hmm. That is something they can replicate. But the expertise is not as easy to replicate, right? That just takes time and effort. And thus far, they haven't even started to expend the effort, really. So let alone the time. So thus far, it's an unassailable position for the United States right now. Nobody else just has the resources or experience to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, hypothetically, if the United States did stop doing it, you could see a series of bilateral agreements from regional powers to try to police their own areas. And then if there were enough of those around the world, you could have a de facto new system in place that could fulfill that role. Hypothetically, Europe, for example, could police its seaways, and then Middle Eastern powers could police their seaways. East Asian powers could police their seaways, et cetera, right? So you could have like an interlinked chain of regional powers providing security in global sea lanes such that it had the same effect as a global hegemon doing it. That's feasible, but it's also relatively unlikely, and even worse, it's very unstable, because a lot of that is going to require the cooperation of different regional powers within a given region. And if you've been following regional politics in the Middle East or East Asia, you know that cooperation is probably not going to be in the cards anytime soon. So that makes it relatively unlikely for agreements like that to form in the first place. And then even if they do form, there's probably going to be some kind of drama in the relationships between those countries that eventually undermines the agreement, maybe even leads them to come to blows and start actively trying to sabotage each other's foreign trade. So therein lies the value of global hegemon, right? Like in that case, you have some third party guaranteeing, the security of the sea lane, so you don't have to worry about petty intra-regional drama of one kind or another. Yeah, the only real trouble with the global hegemon problem is that sometimes the global hegemon does stuff that you don't want it to do. The lack of accountability there is the principal problem from a regional perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. The Leviathan ideally is benevolent, and if they're not, all you can really do is shake your fist and scold them verbally, but it's not really like a credible military threat.
Yeah, so that's the trade-off you make. With the global hegemon, you get more security, more stability, more predictability, but in exchange, you lose discretion as a regional actor. So overall, Zehan makes good points, I would say. Like the foundation of his analysis is generally pretty good. I've learned stuff from him, over time. But the trouble with Zehan, in my opinion, is that he takes that good foundation and then he just dramatizes it with overly dramatic conclusions. the birth rate thing is a totally valid point. Like, that's going to be a factor going forward. So he's smart to home in on that. But then he says weird shit like that it's going to completely destroy these countries that have low birth rates and they have no future. Like, that's a wild exaggeration. I don't think that's going to be the case. And a lot of his analysis suffers from that kind of dramatization, I would argue.
Well, is he a content creator? Because we're definitely in a clickbait era. So if he's like trying to make a point, but then he also wants YouTube views, it makes sense to make it spicy.
He's not a content creator in sort of the nouveau sense. He's not like a YouTube guy, if that's what you mean. He's like a traditional pundit, let's say. So, he's the kind of guy that gets invited to talk on news programs, does book tours. He actually makes a lot of money from his books. I think that's his main source of income. Mm-hmm. But then he gets, speaking tours, he gets invited to seminars, that kind of stuff. Like, that's more his style rather than like some of the nouveau vague, I totally made that word, some of that newer style of clickbait that you see on social media. That's not really his bag so much.
Nouveau might be the word you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think Nouveau Vague was like a band. I think I vaguely remember something like that. I think Michael used to play it back in the day.
Well, my brother got back to me. He's on a bullet train right now from Shinagawa to Nagoya.
Oh, okay.
And he posted a GIF from the bullet train movie.
Oh, cool. So he's more in southern Japan then, sounds like.
He said he wouldn't be sure how to identify an entrepreneur, so he's not too sure about that one. And then to the point of treatment of tourists, he said that everyone he interacted with has been notably friendly and kind, and that's without him being able to fully communicate. They make an obvious effort to help and anticipate his needs. So, seems like a very nice place to go.
Yeah,
at least as a foreigner of his type. He's a very well-mannered person, too, so he wouldn't be the kind to make a ruckus and cause drama.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I've never ridden on a bullet train before. It must be an experience. What is it? They go like 100 miles an hour? Maybe more than that?
Let's see. How fast do bullet trains go? 200 miles an hour.
Ah. Pretty fast.
Only the maglev train on the China Railway and the Indonesian Jakarta Bandung high speed are faster than those.
Oh, wow. I didn't know they had one in Jakarta. Good for them.
Bullet trains are cool. It's usually going to be a safer experience than the movie for anyone who saw that. That's a pretty heavy dramatization of what goes on in a bullet train. Did you happen to see that movie?
Not yet. It's on my list.
It's silly good fun.
That's what I heard.
Yeah. Well, cool. We're all caught up on questions.
Yep, looks that way.
You wish the U.S. had a large bullet train network. That would be awesome to at least get from coast to center to coast and jump time zones. We have so much land to cover, and most of the railways are heavily prioritized for freight. If you've ever taken a personal train, I don't know what it's called, for
Amtrak.
Civilians. Yeah, Amtrak. You can get delayed for hours at a time based on the freight schedule because you're just lower priority than freight.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a really good Windover Productions YouTube video about that.
Passenger train, thank you. There's someone who's named City Nerd. They had a video about which U.S. city pairs would make the most sense for high-speed rail. It'd also be
I don't know if
pretty
I
fun.
want one between Dallas and Houston. It's too many gangs in Houston.
I don't know if I've
I
even
can stay down there.
been to Houston.
You've never been to Houston?
I don't think so. I don't know if I had a reason to go there.
Huh.
I've been
So
to
you've
San
never been to
Antonio
the-
many times. I've been to College Station. I've been to Austin.
So you've never been to the Space Center down there?
No, I don't think so. We went
That's
to a
pretty
space
cool.
center in Florida.
Oh, okay.
It's a pretty good time.
Yeah, I went to the Space Center in Houston when I was a kid, and I kind of enjoyed it. It's pretty cool. They actually had I don't know if it was like an actual version or a test model, but they had one of the emergency exit vehicles that they have up at that they eventually added to the International Space Station. It's like a little shuttle that they could use as a getaway if they needed to. So they actually had that in the shop that they were working in.
Cool.
It's pretty neat. Other than that, it was okay. SeaWorld was fun. They have a really nice SeaWorld in Houston, or at least they did in like 1990, whatever, when I went.
I'm pretty sure it's going to be heavily modified from what it used to be. I also went to a SeaWorld too, but the number of big whales that they have, I think it's pretty illegal to get new whales and put them in captivity, but they're trying to use a legal loophole to keep the offspring of ones that are already captive still captive. So they may still be able to do whale shows and stuff like that. But
Gotcha.
yeah, there have been a few different layers of ethical consideration that have gone at SeaWorld since we used to go when we were kids.
Well, so long as they still have puffins, it's worth it.
Puffins are very cool looking.
Yeah, I do enjoy the puffin.
The highest point in Florida is 350 feet above sea level.
Yeah, it's been a problem. There's been really bad flooding there the past couple weeks.
All there was is swamp.
Yeah, it's kind of fallen into the ocean a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, they better watch out. I think a lot of insurance companies have started pulling coverage in Florida for some houses in some regions, specifically because it just floods too much and it's just getting worse. Yeah, you may not believe in climate change, but you better believe in home insurance.
That's good.
Yeah,
Well
a lot more
played.
people are going to be compelled by the latter than the former.
Yeah, true. When it comes to the value of your own personal property and the relative risk of something bad happening, you better put some money down even if you're skeptical of climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's going to have an impact for sure.
Well, cool. Well, if you want, I can take a break here and we can transition over to the Wizard Coast.
Oh, sounds good. I don't think I had too many more items. Pretty minor stuff.
Sure, if you had any little things to mention at the end, that's cool.
Nothing we can't talk about next time.
Well, cool. Well, thank you, chat, for tuning in and joining the discussion for another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.